Why is this election so historic?
Yeah, so of course we have the Trump arraignment happening in New York City, in Wisconsin. There's a high-profile Supreme Court race going on today as well. So a big day in politics. But here in Chicago, there's really a monumental occasion of two very different strands of politics facing off against one another, ostensibly two Democrats going head to head, although one of them is from the far right end of the spectrum, if you even want to call it, as part of the Democratic Party. He's a former head of the school system in Chicago named Paul Vallas.
The
He
CEO of the school system, is that correct?
Exactly. So, in Chicago, there's this weird, basically in the mid 90s, there was this, it's a long story, but there was an effort that was actually led by Republicans in Springfield in, alignment with Mayor Daley at that time, who was kind of a conservative Democrat himself, who was a longtime mayor of the city. They worked to put the schools under mayoral control. So most cities across the country, there's some democracy when it comes to the school system. In
Right.
Chicago, for decades, since the mid 90s, the schools have been under a board of education that's appointed by the mayor. And that included the head of the system, which was no longer a superintendent, but in the 90s became a chief executive officer, as you said, a CEO. And Paul Vallis was the first one of those.
Wow. And is
So,
that still the case with education in Chicago now, or is it elect
so
it has moved to
actually,
elections?
exactly. So this past year just saw a really incredible change in which an elected school board was both embraced by Democratic voters in Chicago and across the state. The state approved it. So there will be, it's going to phase in, but there is going to be an elected school board now. It's going to take a
Okay.
few years before it fully becomes, the people choosing, and the mayor is still going to have an outweighted say. But yes, there has been movement. And in fact, one of the big champions of that effort to bring more democracy to the school system is Paul Vallis's opponent in the race, Brandon Johnson, who is a former public school teacher and former union organizer with the Chicago Teachers Union, and a longtime backer of really a strong progressive vision that includes, social investments and alternatives to the type of over policing that has marked the city for so long. And what's interesting about the race is that while Paul Vallis has gotten so much funding from right wing forces, so, there's people like Ken Griffin, who's this Republican mega donor who actually just fled
God,
Illinois and moved to Florida because he
of
was like,
course.
the Democrats are, uh, too out of control. He's still using, his billions of dollars. He's a hedge fund manager of Citadel, which is a very powerful hedge fund. He's
Yeah.
using that to fund all these efforts to, blunt progressive policies. He spent millions of dollars to stop a progressive income tax from passing in Illinois. And he
Jesus.
is, and his, allies are the people that are funding Paul Vallis. Paul Vallis is still claiming to be a Democrat, but he has said, that he, back in 2009, actually right after Obama won the presidency, he said he was more of a Republican than a Democrat. And, a lot of people have seen that as a bit of like a dog whistle thing of like, the first black man is elected as the head of the Democratic Party and as president, and then you decide to jet, and leave the party and call yourself a Republican. He also says he's fundamentally opposed to abortion. He's attacked unions time and time again. He's
Sure.
been on the yeah. So
So
he
you've got sort of
basically
like
is a right wing guy.
yeah. Right, exactly. And but because it's Chicago, he feels like he's gotta moonlight or pretend to be a Democrat, in order to win the mayoral race. And of course, this is after Lori Lightfoot was ousted by voters and didn't get into the top 2. And that's why you got Brandon Johnson, who we're all pulling for and we're rooting for, and go Chicago, against, yes, this, sort of free market loving, teacher hating Paul Vallis. And who's, yes, we'll get into some of the weird things he said. But I want to ask about, like, what's their narrative? Like, what are they running on, in the wake of Lori Lightfoot, who I think was criticized rightly, in my opinion, obviously by the left and progressives for her handling of the Black Lives Matter movement and criminal justice reform or lack thereof. And then probably criticized by the right for the exact same thing. What's the narrative that both Vallas and Johnson are floating here? What are they offering?
Sure. So Brandon Johnson has said his goal is to kind of repair the tale of two cities that has marked Chicago for many decades now, where you have massive investment from hedge funds and corporate centers that are funneling money into downtown and into the north side and into wealthier, whiter areas, whereas we've seen mass disinvestment across much of the parts of the city that are occupied by residents of color, frankly, and that are poor, that have been left behind. And in order to reconcile that, he's proposed basically a downward redistribution of wealth, taxing the wealthy and corporations and massively increasing investments into these areas that have been left behind. And some of the ways of doing that has been a proposal to have year-round funding for youth employment, which, as
Nice.
many studies have shown, is the way to actually attack the root causes of crime and violence, not to mention poverty, which is endemic in these areas. And so it's really a progressive vision based on equality and equity in the city
Mhm.
that would be transformational, considering the way that corporate backed interests have controlled politics in the city for so long, both under Daley as well as Rahm Emanuel, who was mayor for many years himself. He basically handed the city over to the highest bidder and pushed all these privatization plans, closed schools, and certainly Paul Vallas is promising more of the same. And I would say about Lori Lightfoot is that she promised a progressive vision. That's what she ran on. And I think that's why she won, is because she made commitments to invest in affordable housing, to support alternative approaches to things like mental health, to increase investments, to fund public schools. And then she reneged on those promises once she got
Mm.
into office. She pretty quickly shifted her politics to become more like her predecessors in Rahm Emanuel. And Paul Vallis, what he's running on is he just says, crime and cops all the time, basically.
Right.
He's
I
just
mean,
trying to do a laser focus on the issue of crime and public safety. But his solutions to that are not the kind of more comprehensive approaches that Brandon Johnson's offering. They're strictly, let's put more money and hire more cops and put money into law enforcement. Whereas we've seen that's been the strategy for so many
right.
years, and we've only seen the police budget increase. We've only seen the number of cops increase, and yet crime has not gone down. Specifically in the areas where it's most prevalent, because crime, especially violent crime, is really segregated in the city. And the
Yeah.
areas that it's impacting the most are actually the areas that, at least in the first round, tended not to go for Paul Vallis. So I think he's using real fear tactics to appeal to the type of largely white voters and more affluent voters in the city that are freaked out by the idea of crime, but they actually aren't the ones that are facing the results of it. And what we've seen is, when we've had investments in these alternatives, because there are some pilot programs that do things that Brandon Johnson is calling for in
Mhm.
the city right now, that provide um, mental health specialists to go along with police to respond to emergencies, that have hotlines that so people can call, because we know that a large amount of 911 calls are for people that are experiencing emergencies, but they don't
Right.
necessarily, it's not an ongoing crime. And those programs are successful, right?
Yeah.
So we've seen that there is actual benefit to the type of policies being approached by Brandon Johnson, and not to mention the whole host of left-wing candidates that have recently won office in the city of Chicago that have similarly run on these platforms. But Paul Vallis
Yeah.
has just said, no, the answer is cops. So
Right, of course, the same thing. I mean, and maybe cops plus, because he's, he's got this privatization record, specifically with schools, which I want you to just expand upon, and then maybe what would he do if he were the head of a police force or just a mayor? Like, how could Chicago, which, to be honest with you, as someone who doesn't know Chicago very well, the times that I have been, I'm like, and I know it's changing, but I was like, wow, this is a city that feels like there's a little bit more of a middle class than, let's say, where I was living, which is San Francisco, or cities that are like super divided, like incredible, inequality and gaps between the rich and poor, Chicago's like, all right, this still has some sort of middle class that's like, you know, living here. I assume he would probably want to do away with that. But anyway, I wanted to ask you about what is his privatization record, especially when it comes to, this is fascinating, New Orleans and the school system there.
So Paul Vallas is actually, he's walked away from this, but he previously bragged about the fact that there are no longer any public schools in New Orleans after he became the head of the school system there after Katrina. He went in and basically took over the Recovery School District and replaced all the private schools with charters, with alternatives run by private operators that largely had a profit motive, that were virulently anti-union, and worked to cancel all collective bargaining agreements, and that actually were really horrible for many students because they enforced these strict zero tolerance policies. So students would face expulsion or suspension for really minor infractions, like wearing the wrong color, article of clothing one day or something. And the result of that is, yes, people were able to, kids got kicked out of the school district. And he bragged about test scores going up, but they implemented these really laser set approaches, provided standardized testing as the only determinant of student success. So teachers just would teach to the test. And then so many kids got kicked out, expelled and suspended from the schools. That helped to kind of change the numbers that made it look like he was being a successful administrator. But what he was really doing was taking all control out of the hands of the actual residents of New Orleans. Right. And in Chicago, when he was the head of the school system here, first of all, he privatized the janitorial services, like custodial staff, and that helped to really create discord within the schools, because as anybody who's gone and worked in a school knows, it's a community, right? And then people know each other, they work together, the teachers, the custodial staff. And so when you bring in private contractors, they don't have those same relationships. That really lowered the cleanliness of the schools. But then he also set up these standards which opened the door to mass school closures that were done later, especially under Rahm Emanuel. He closed 50 schools by using a lot of the same criteria that Paul Vallas had put in place when he was CEO. So that's kind of his record on privatization. He's done it everywhere he's been. When he was in Philadelphia, Paul Vallas was the head of the school system there. He pursued privatization. He did it in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And they actually brought him to both Haiti and Chile as well after earthquakes in 2010. And there he pushed this kind of Milton Friedman supermarket focused approach. So he has a long track record of doing this across not just the country, but across the globe.
That's insane. He reminds me of the former chief of police in New York when I was living there, the former NYPD head. What was his name? Like Kelly. His last name's Kelly, and I'm forgetting his first name. But he's like, he oversaw like the RNC mass arrests in the year 2004 when I was arrested. And like, I was like, this guy, I think it's Charles Kelly. I can't remember his name, but I was like, this guy, he's a criminal. Like he's a total thug. He's just sweeping up people who are nonviolently protesting. He's never going to get a job. This guy's a disgrace. No. He's contracted all over the world to work with police across the world. This is like the same, consultant from hell, but for schools. Like, oh, you want more charters? You want to privatize things? You want to break up unions? I'm your guy.
Exactly. I think that it's a classic case of the conservative white guys failing up, and it just keeps on going. But the failure, it just depends on what your judgment is, because he's made a lot of money for a lot of people, right? There's been interests that have been benefiting.
Your charter school, if you're the DeVos family. I mean, I don't know.
Exactly. And you actually see that there's this PAC that was started by the DeVos family that has funded Paul Vallas in this race for Chicago mayor. And that PAC is also taking a lot of money from the Walton family, which is, the richest family in the country that runs Walmart. So the billionaires are really getting behind their candidate. And it's not because they think he's failing. It's because they think he's being successful, because the money keeps, flowing upward. And we keep on being able to resist teacher unions. And I think that that's actually a real fundamental point about this election, is that Paul Vallas, his plan is to take on the Chicago Teachers Union that has become a really powerful force in city politics in terms of building a progressive alternative to this neoliberal corporate model that has run city governance for so many years. And they've done that through backing challengers, especially in the city council, but now on the mayoral level as well. And Brandon Johnson obviously comes out of the CTU. The CTU helped to lead a number of strikes that were not only over quality of life issues in the schools, but really bargaining for the common good, trying to increase the type of issues that can be bargained over to address things like housing and affordability, and students facing homelessness, things like this. That's the kind of approach of the Chicago Teachers Union, and that's what I think a lot of these interests see as a real threat to the type of politics as usual that's been in place for so long. And so Paul Vallas would be a
He's their
vehicle
guy.
in
He's
which
perfectly their guy.
Exactly. And he would be able to probably be pretty effective because he is ruthless when it comes to these types of policies. He has a long record of it, and he has so many friends across the country that are part of this corporate first agenda. And that's what's interesting about these races that are nonpartisan, is that you're right. Paul Vallas claims to be a Democrat, says he's a lifelong Democrat. He's even gotten a lot of like Obama world behind him. The people like Dick Durbin. Yeah, exactly. And Arnie Duncan is a big backer, who was an education secretary under Obama, is a big backer of Vallas. So a lot of these people have gotten into his court. But if this was a race where you had to have a party affiliation, Paul Vallas would definitely be the Republican in the race, because look at the type of policies he's running on. They're all in line. And a lot of the people that are backing him, including John Catanzara, who's the head of the police union in Chicago, which has endorsed Paul Vallas, is a huge Trump supporter and has been outspoken about, saying that it's a witch hunt against Trump, and, this indictment is a national disgrace and things like this, and is actually a big supporter of the January 6th insurrectionists. Like, these are the people that are in Paul Vallas's camp, and yet he's claiming to be a Democrat.
I wanted to throw this up here. Speaking of that witch hunt line, I think Vallas also echoed it, asked in a radio conversation about efforts to hold the 45th president to account for stirring up supporters who sought to block certification of the 2020 election results. Vallas said of the impeachment initiative, "I've always felt it was a witch hunt." So here you go. Witch hunt. He said it from his mouth.
There's a whole long history of basically the 2 years running up to this election. Paul Vallas has spent courting the far right and the MAGA voters. And he's done that by going on shows by people like Jeannie Ives, who was a right-wing challenger to even the Republican that ended up running for governor in the last time around. She was a far right of him, as well as he spoke at a fundraiser for this group, Awake Illinois, that is completely homophobic and transphobic. That's their whole political agenda.
Sure.
So it's no surprise. And when he's done these appearances on a lot of these shows, he's said this kind of stuff. He's been super critical, not just of Biden, but of Obama and J.B. Pritzker, all these like national Democrats. And he's been kind of defensive of Trump and the far right. Certainly said things that are more letting off the hook a lot of the people involved in the January 6th Capitol riot. So this is the type of community that Paul Vallas has been appealing to. Now he's tried to moderate, right? And he's just focused on crime and tried to avoid saying any of these things that could be a little bit more controversial.
Yeah. Can you just tell me, because when will we know, what is it looking like in terms of polling, and what would it mean if Brandon Johnson won?
It would truly be historic if Brandon Johnson won. This is 40 years out from when Harold Washington became mayor of Chicago, and he was the last time there was a progressive mayor in the city. He was also the first Black mayor, and he faced a lot of challenges because the entrenched interests and networks in the city ossified to help to block anything he would put forward. And I think we would probably see a kind of similar pushback under a Brandon Johnson administration. The difference is there's a lot of really progressive left-wing people in office right now across the city council. He has
I met some of them.
Tons. Yeah, exactly. You know what I'm talking about. So
Hmm.
there's a squad here in Chicago that's ready to back him up and really help to harness the momentum that has come behind him in this election. In terms of polling, I mean, the race is happening right now. There's a few hours left until polls close. We'll see what I have seen some heartening numbers
Hmm.
of youth involvement,
Mm,
because it was really dismal in the first round of this race, the primary, basically in late
right.
February. Only 3% of voters from 18 to 24 voted.
Shit.
That's sad,
That's
right?
terrible. Yeah.
And that's where he has the most support, is among young voters, not just 18-year-olds. Obviously, I mean, anybody basically under 50 is more likely to be a Brandon Johnson voter, but those are communities that are less likely to actually come out and vote, not
Right.
because they don't support him, but just because it's not in their nature. They need more motivation. Whereas the older voters, who are much more likely to go for ballots, especially older white voters, are incredibly consistent in Chicago when it comes to turning out to vote.
I
And
know.
so I think that's really what it's going to come down to, is the turnout. Because if it was just judged off popularity, of course, I think Brandon Johnson would be cruising to victory. But you got to actually go and cast your ballot. So
You've got yeah, yeah, exactly. And I can imagine that defeating Lori Lightfoot in the run, I mean, in the first round here, was probably a pretty big boost to young folks who are like, oh shit, it's not just going to be kind of this mealy mouthed, you know, same old. We might have something real. So I feel like having a real progressive candidate could excite young folks if they get out. If you are listening in the Chicago and you are from, you can vote in the Chicago mayor's race. Go vote. God damn it. Stay in line. But so excited. Thank you so much for dropping by, Miles. Is there anything else you wanted to add? I mean, like, is it's gonna really suck if he loses, if Brandon Johnson loses. And I say that, I'm sorry that's so glib, but like it'll be more than it would be awful. I similarly felt the same way here in LA's mayoral race. Against whatever the fuck his asshat name is. I forgot what his name is already because I don't care
well,
about
I'll
him.
just say I think there's actually some real parallels to, Paul Vallas is not as rich as Rick Caruso was,
Thank
but
you.
he's similarly an agent of the ruling class, right? Who is been set up to take down a progressive challenger. And I think Brandon Johnson is even more from the real, like,
Oh
left
yeah.
wing fighting movement than Karen Bass, although Karen Bass obviously has, more actual elected experience.
Karen Bass sort of sits
They're different.
between Lightfoot and, Brandon Johnson. We'll see, TBD. And Caruso is, I mean, he's an agent of Auntie Anne's pretzel factory as well. He just,
Yeah.
because he's a, if
And he owns
you,
those movie theaters and stuff, right? And the
exactly. I
complexes
know.
in the
I
West.
hate it. I have, and he charges way too much for parking, son of a bitch. But yeah, sorry, I
Yeah.
interrupted you.
Well, I just think I mean, it's a similar dynamic, right? Is that one of the candidates is the one put up by the billionaires, and another candidate is the one that's literally coming out of the union, the most left wing fighting militant labor union,
Yeah.
probably in the Midwest. And that's the stakes of this election.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/bitchuation room. Do